Dark was the sky above King's Landing on the eve of the great battle, the kind of dark that settled not only across the heavens but also within men's hearts. A swirling wind carried the stench of salt and sewage up from Blackwater Bay, past the towering walls and into the cramped streets of the capital. The city's residents waited in trembling anticipation, half hidden behind shuttered windows and bolted doors, uncertain if sunrise would bring salvation or a swifter death than any they had yet known. Soldiers hustled along the battlements, carrying flaming torches that flickered against the formidable blackness of the night. The breath of war was upon them, and even the bravest souls felt its chill. Jon Snow arrived at King's Landing under a cloak of secrecy that few could penetrate. He had come reluctantly, in the company of those loyal to the North and those who had found themselves in uncertain allegiances after Robb Stark's fortunes had taken a turn for the worse. A swirl of fate had drawn Jon out of the Night's Watch, for he had disobeyed vows in pursuit of answers about his heritage and the entangled destiny that lay before him. His journey southward had been a quiet one, overshadowed by the rightful condemnation that he was a deserter in the eyes of many. Yet war had a strange way of inverting moral absolutes. With the realm at stake, new alliances had been born from dire necessity. He had joined a ragged band of northern outriders initially aligned with Stannis Baratheon, a disparate cluster of men bound more by their combined desperation than any high cause. Stories drifted through the camp. The Lannisters had seized the crown through cunning and betrayal. Joffrey Baratheon was nothing but a vicious boy king with cruelty pulsing in his veins. Stannis Baratheon claimed to be the rightful heir, but his relentless faith in a new red god and the unyielding hardness in his eyes had alienated many. Renly had been struck down by a shadow that defied comprehension. War upon war was erupting, and each road south was stained with blood. But Jon had pressed on, quietly resolute. He bore the burdens of his own secrets and a sense of duty that would not let him turn away from the conflict that might determine the fate of all Westeros. He did not ride under any official banner. When asked by Stannis's men who he was, he would answer only that he was of the North. Some recognized the look in his face, reminiscent of the late Lord Eddard Stark. Some believed his word and left him alone. Others made quiet remarks about the bastard of Winterfell, a name that still pricked at Jon's pride, though he tried to hide it. Some nights, he recalled the words that had bound him to the Night's Watch, where no crowns and win no glory. Yet the world was different now. Beyond the narrow horizon of the wall lay White Walkers stirring to life, an otherworldly threat that most men refused to believe in. He had tried to warn them. The realm's petty wars might all be rendered meaningless if the undead marched upon them. But no one truly listened. They had their battles here, in these southern lands, and Jon found himself in the thick of it. As if the old gods or the new had decided, he must not be absent from the story that would soon unfold. If he had expected to find clarity in King's Landing, he was disappointed. The city was a maze of intrigues. Spies watched from every corner, and tongues wagged at every well. He had chosen to keep a low profile, rarely stepping beyond the perimeter of the camp. Even so, Ser Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, had singled Jon out once among the ranks. Davos's shrewd eyes spoke of a man who'd seen too much war, too much heartbreak. He seemed both curious and respectful of the quiet northern newcomer, but he asked no pointed questions. War did not give men the luxury of exploring every mystery. It demanded focus, action, a willingness to set aside riddles until the day was won. On the night before the battle, the combined forces loyal to Stannis made final preparations. Siege weapons were tested, swords sharpened, crossbows strung tight. Tension stretched across the encampment like a drawn bowstring. Yet to Jon, there was a current of excitement as well. Whispers said that Joffrey himself would be present on the battlements or stationed somewhere behind the walls, orchestrating a performance of power. The Golden Lion of House Lannister still roared, but if Joffrey were to die in the coming assault, that roar might collapse into whimpers. The realm might be spared further horrors inflicted by that cruel boy's hand. Jon found himself on the waterfront, gazing out at the black waters swirling beneath a moon that gave little light. His heart pounded with the knowledge that once battle commenced, there could be no going back. The plan, as far as he understood it, was for Stannis' fleet to sail up the Blackwater rush, break through the chain rumored to be lurking beneath the dark waters, and storm the city. Men would scale the walls or breach the gates. The Lannisters would fight fiercely, but many believed that Stannis Baratheon would take the city by dawn. Jon was not entirely aligned with Stannis, nor was he comfortable with raising arms against anyone he did not know personally to be evil. Yet Joffrey's crimes, as told in hushed campfire tales, had kindled a vengeful spark. He had heard how the boy had ordered Ned Stark's head struck from his shoulders. He had heard how Sansa Stark was held captive as a hostage in all but name. Joffrey Baratheon had shown no mercy, no sense of honor. He was a monstrous boy playing at king. For the sake of the North, for the sake of House Stark's legacy, and even for the sake of the realm, perhaps it was time for him to die. The night gave way to a dawn that arrived gray and trembling. The waters of Blackwater Bay frothed as Stannis' fleet advanced. Atop the battlements, alarm bells rang. Lannister soldiers hurried to man positions along the walls. Shouts echoed across the water. On the horizon, the first flickers of wildfire glowed with an unholy green. The moment stretched with agonizing slowness, everything poised on a knife's edge. Then, as though the gods themselves had unleashed their fury, an explosion of green flame erupted in the bay, turning ships to fiery husks, water to inferno. Jon watched, horrified yet transfixed. The burning fleet reminded him of half-remembered nightmares, visions he had dreamt on cold nights atop the wall, images the old gods might have pressed into his mind. Men shrieked and leapt overboard, devoured by the scorching waters. For a moment, despair and chaos threatened to unravel Stannis' invasion completely. The chain was raised, trapping many ships in the conflagration. But Stannis Baratheon did not falter. The fury of the Crown's defense was strong, but not all of the fleet was destroyed, and Stannis' ground troops pressed on in small landing vessels and across makeshift rafts that beached closer to the city's walls. Chaos took hold. Jon was one of those who scrambled onto the rocky shore, sword in hand, breath burning in his lungs from the green smoke that wafted across the battlefield. He was no knight, and he had no illusions about the horror that awaited him. But he had learned from the best. He carried within him the teachings of his uncle, Benjen Stark, and the practical skills gleaned from the few masters-at-arms who had trained him at Winterfell. His reflexes were sharpened by the constant threat of death in the north. Now, he found that primal focus settling into his bones. The second his boots touched land, he readied himself. Around him, knights and sellswords and common foot soldiers advanced against archers perched on the city walls. Ladders banged against stone. Men roared battle cries or shrieked in terror. Stepping carefully over fallen bodies, Jon advanced. It felt to him like stepping into a crucible of madness. Catapults flung barrels of burning pitch over the ramparts. The clash of steel against steel rang through the air. The reek of blood mingled with the acrid tang of wildfire. The memory of Ned Stark's execution spurred Jon forward. He had not been there to protect the man who had raised him, but if the chance came to rid the world of Joffrey, would he take it? The question haunted him. It felt as though the eyes of his father and every Stark ancestor watched from beyond, judging his every move. Somehow, in that chaos, he scaled a ladder, dodging arrows by mere inches. A man next to him took a bolt to the throat, tumbling down onto those climbing behind him. Jon clenched his jaw, forced his way upward. At the top of the wall, he was met by the frenzied combat of men in Lannister crimson fighting men bearing the stag of Baratheon or no sigil at all. The deck of stone was slick with blood. Swords flashed in every direction. Jon ducked beneath a wild swing, spun, and ran his blade through a Lannister soldier. The man's eyes widened, and he collapsed in a wet heap. Jon tasted bile at the back of his throat. He'd killed before, wildlings, foes at the wall, but every life taken weighed upon him. In the thick of battle, such reflections could not be indulged for long. He pressed forward, pushing past bodies, uncertain precisely where he was going until he found a narrow stair that wound down inside the walls. He took it. Step after step, he descended into a corridor that echoed with shouts. At a turn, he came face to face with 3 gold-cloaked guards. They recognized neither sigil nor device upon him. The moment froze. One guard yelled, "For the king!" and charged. Jon parried the blow, the clang of steel reverberating through his arms. Another guard slashed at his side, but Jon twisted away in time. Muscle memory honed from endless training at Winterfell guided him, and the Watchers of the Wall had taught him how to handle multiple attackers. Still, it was no easy feat. He found himself half-cornered against the cold stone. The echo of his heartbeat roared in his ears. Desperation lent him strength. He lunged, driving Longclaw through the ribs of the first gold cloak. The Valyrian steel made a dreadful hiss as it slid free. The second guard swung high. Jon ducked and felt a rush of air over his head. He came up inside the man's guard, smashing his pommel against the guard's temple. The third man hesitated, clearly unsettled by the speed of this unnamed northerner. That was all the time Jon needed. He slashed low, severing flesh and tendons. The guard went down in a howl of agony. Jon's breath came in ragged gasps, the coppery smell of blood saturating the corridor. He wanted to keep moving, to find some vantage, to do something that would aid the assault. If Joffrey was truly present, in the thick of it, perhaps this was the moment. If the Boy King fell, the city might surrender. He pressed on, heart pounding with every step, guided by a strange compulsion he could not fully name. Above him, the battle raged. Screams pierced the dim air. He heard the trampling of boots overhead, the crash of barrels, the shouts of men rallying for or against the king. Then he rounded a corner into a small courtyard within the walls, where a line of Lannister men stood defending some key passage. A quick glance told Jon that the passage likely led deeper into the Red Keep. They were well-armed and disciplined, presumably the last strong bulwark before the royal family's refuge. The scent of burning pitch filled his nostrils. He was not alone. A handful of Stannis' men, or perhaps Selzward's loyal to the gold promised them, clashed against the Lannisters, and for a moment the courtyard filled with the clang and grind of swords. Jon slid into the fray, a ghost among them. He narrowly avoided a mace aimed at his skull, slashed the wielder across the midsection, rolled away as another sword descended where he had stood just an instant before. The scramble of violence thundered in his ears, but he forced himself to remain calm. Eventually, after a brutal exchange of blows, the Lannister line broke. Half of them lay dead or dying on the stones, and the survivors fled through the passage behind them. Jon advanced, uncertain if it was wise or foolish. The men next to him, equally battered and drenched in sweat and blood, pressed forward with desperate resolve. Was it hope of plunder, or the dream of glory, or a sense of duty? Jon could not say. All he knew was that he was being pulled deeper into the labyrinth of the Red Keep, as though the threads of fate conspired to bring him face to face with the one figure whose death might change the realm forever. He moved with caution through a dark corridor, the shouts and clash of arms echoing from every direction. Suddenly, a swirl of torchlight revealed a lone figure stepping from a side passage. Jon froze, every muscle alert. He recognized the gold-laced armor, the finery of the cloak embroidered with lions in shining thread. He recognized the face, a face he had seen only from afar in the courtyard at Winterfell when King Robert had come to name Ned Stark Hand of the King. Joffrey Baratheon. The Boy King was flanked by 2 members of the Kingsguard, resplendent in their white cloaks. Joffrey's face was contorted with a blend of anger and fear. His eyes were wild, flicking from Jon to the corridor beyond, as though he were uncertain whether to flee or fight. Jon's heart hammered. This was the boy who had demanded his father's head. This was the boy who had tormented Sansa, who had shown no pity or justice. The realm despised him for his cruelty. Yet here he was, flesh and blood, frightened in the gloom, only a sword's length away. 2 Kingsguard knights stood poised to defend him, but they too showed strain in their stance. The city was under siege, and madness reigned everywhere. Jon did not speak. In truth, words would have failed him. Everything in him roared with the need for justice. His father's face, the pleas of Sansa, Arya's vanished silhouette, Robb's battles in the field. They all coalesced into a single purpose. One of the king's guard lunged, radiant steel flashing in the uncertain light. Jon barely parried. The power behind the blow drove him back a step. These were no common guards, but trained knights sworn to protect the king at all costs. The second king's guard circled to Jon's left, meaning to pin him between them. Joffrey hovered in the background, pale-faced, a hand on the hilt of his own ornate sword, but apparently too cowardly to join the fray unless forced. The knights attacked in quick succession. Jon ducked and weaved, Longclaw meeting their blades. His arms ached with the force of impact. The smaller corridor offered little room to maneuver, but he tried to use that to his advantage. If they could not flank him properly, it might be his salvation. Sparks flew with each clash of steel. The first knight, bald beneath his white helm, attacked with relentless precision, slashing high and low, aiming to catch Jon off balance. The second knight attempted to dart in and strike from the side. Jon's breath came fast. He let instinct guide him, stepping inside a blow and twisting so that Longclaw's Valyrian steel sliced across the first knight's throat. Blood spattered the stone. A thunderous heartbeat later, the second knight seized his chance, slashing downward at Jon's now open guard. Jon raised Longclaw in desperation. The blade caught the blow, though it numbed Jon's arm to the shoulder. He twisted free with a grunt. The knight pressed in, unrelenting, but Jon saw an opening. A quick sidestep, a lunge, and Longclaw sank through the gap in the knight's armor. With a strangled gasp, the knight fell to his knees, then toppled onto the stones. Jon stood there, the space filled with the labored rasp of his breath. Blood dripped from Longclaw's tip. The Kingsguard knights lay dead at his feet, men of renown in shining white cloaks reduced to still forms pooling red. He raised his eyes to Joffrey. The boy king's face went pale as milk. For all his cruelty, he was but a boy. His lips trembled. For a moment, they stared at one another. Two young men from different worlds, caught in the savage machinery of war. Then Joffrey let out a shrill cry, drew his sword, and charged. Jon parried the clumsy attack easily. Joffrey had been trained, no doubt, but fear had stolen the fluid grace of practice. He swung wildly, unable to mask the terror in his eyes. Jon batted aside the blows, a cold emptiness gathering within him. Perhaps it was the thought of Ned Stark's final moments. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this boy could have shown mercy on Sansa, on Arya, on Ned himself, and chose cruelty each time. The realm suffered because of him, and would suffer more if he continued his reign. A savage cry tore from Jon's throat as he knocked Joffrey's blade aside, stepped in, and drove Longclaw into the king's chest. Joffrey froze, his eyes widening in shock. Blood trickled from his mouth, and his sword clattered from his grip. He looked down as though he couldn't comprehend the dark stain spreading across his gold-embroidered tunic. Then he slumped forward onto Jon's shoulder, the faintest whisper escaping his lips, something unintelligible. Perhaps it was a plea, or the cry of a child calling for his mother. Jon pulled Longclaw free. Joffrey crumpled to the floor, eyes half-lidded, skin ashen. For an instant, the entire corridor seemed to go silent. Perhaps outside, men still died and war still raged, but in that flicker of time, a hush enveloped Jon, as though the gods themselves had paused to acknowledge what had just transpired. The boy king was dead. Killed by Jon Snow, a bastard of Winterfell, oathbreaker of the Night's Watch, now a soldier of chance in the war for the Iron Throne. Breath shaking, Jon stared at the body. He felt neither triumph nor relief, only a grim emptiness. He had committed regicide. He had ended a monstrous child's life, avenging Ned Stark's unjust murder. The consequences of such an act would ripple through the realm in ways he could not foresee. Footsteps thundered nearby. Jon tensed, prepared to fight anew. But he saw only a handful of Stannis' men, weapons drawn, eyes alight with the madness of battle. They saw the dead knights in white cloaks, then Joffrey's twisted form on the ground, gold armor slick with blood. Stunned silence fell among them. One soldier, older with graying hair, dropped to a knee, touching the dead boy king's golden breastplate as though to make sure it was real. "King Joffrey is dead," the man murmured, his voice thick with awe. Jon swallowed. He was drenched in sweat and blood, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. He took a single step back, mindful of how this would look, how it might matter. The older soldier looked up, gaze fierce. "Was it you who put him down?" Jon nodded, too numb to lie. That was when cheering erupted, from the soldiers who stood witness and from those who spilled into the corridor, drawn by the swirling tales that the king lay slain. A cry went up, "Joffrey is dead! The king is dead!" Over and over, men hollered the words, and it was as if a new wind had blown through the corridors of the Red Keep. The impetus to fight on, at least among the defenders who loved Joffrey little, began to wane. The fearsome shadow of Tywin Lannister still loomed somewhere, but the immediate terror that Joffrey would unleash new cruelties upon them had vanished in an instant. Jon stood in the midst of that swirl of chaos, uncertain. He heard the joy, the savage exultation, the disbelief. Soldiers rushed about, some continuing to chase Lannister men, others scouring the Red Keep for stragglers. In the confusion, Jon found himself stepping away, longing for solitude. He wanted out of those cramped corridors that reeked of death. The city's defenders did not surrender at once. The fighting continued through the day. Near the gates, men still battled ferociously. Archers still loosed arrows from the battlements, though many had begun to flee as the news spread that Joffrey Baratheon's blood stained the stones of the keep. In time, King's Landing would learn the truth. The monstrous Boy King was no more. Jon found his way onto a parapet overlooking Blackwater Bay, where the last remnants of Stannis' ships had anchored. The sun was setting now, a blood-red orb sinking behind the horizon. Smoke still rose from the burning hulks in the bay, and the stench of charred wood and flesh drifted on the wind. The city below lay battered, its people cowering. Sporadic bursts of violence echoed here and there as smaller skirmishes broke out. He took a shaky breath. In some corner of his mind, he recalled a time when his life was simpler, hunting with Robb near Winterfell, practicing archery with his siblings. The memory felt like a story belonging to someone else. He rested his hands on the stone battlement, gazing over the city. If Joffrey was dead, what now? Who would take the throne? Would the realm unite behind Stannis? Or would Tywin Lannister strike back with an even deadlier wrath? And what of the North, of Robb's war, of Winterfell's safety? All these questions churned in Jon's mind, but no answers came. He felt exhausted, battered. He had done something that changed the course of the realm, yet he felt little satisfaction. Perhaps vengeance was never meant to be sweet, merely a salve for an unhealed wound. Davos Seaworth found him sometime later. The Onion Knight approached quietly, as though he sensed Jon's solitude. He leaned on the battlement, eyes scanning the city's darkening skyline. For a few moments, neither spoke, wrapped in the hush of the aftermath. Then Davos said, "So it's true. You slew the Boy King." Jon inclined his head slightly, uncertain how to reply. Davos exhaled. "Stannis is pleased. He says it will help us force the city to yield." He sounded uneasy, as if discussing matters far beyond his comfort. "They're already calling you Kingsbane in the camp. I doubt you'll have much privacy once news spreads." Jon stiffened. "I don't want to be called that. I never asked for any such thing." Davos studied him with calm eyes. "Names are given, not chosen, lad. The realm will make what it will of this deed." Another pause, then he added quietly, "King Joffrey was a cruel boy. The world might be better off without him. But I can see you carry the weight all the same." Jon closed his eyes for a moment. "I killed him for what he did to my father, and what he threatened to do to my family. But now I wonder if it will truly change anything. War is war. The Lannisters won't just vanish." "True enough," Davos said. "Yet sometimes a single death can shift the tides of battle and of fate. Stannis means to claim the throne. With Joffrey gone, there's a path there, though it may be narrow." "What of the people of King's Landing?" Jon asked, turning his gaze back to the city. "They're hungry, fearful. Will Stannis be a Kinder King? Davos's face was etched with worry. I wish I could promise that, but I believe he means to rule justly in his own stern way. If we take the throne, it will still mean more war. Tywin Lannister will not go quietly. Jon could only nod. The distant fires twinkled in the gathering dark, an unsteady glow that might have been mistaken for stars on the ground. The realm would continue to quake under the footfalls of armies. He thought of the north, of the wildlings, of the White Walkers stirring beyond the wall. He thought of the father he had lost and the siblings scattered by fate. He felt a longing for Ghost, his albino direwolf, a piece of home he had lost track of in his flight from the Night's Watch. Everything was uncertain, and the sense of dread over what lay ahead pressed down on him. In the following days, King's Landing was forced into a form of submission. With Joffrey's death, many within the city, commoners especially, were relieved. The Gold Cloaks found their morale shaken, unsure whether to continue risking their lives now that their fearsome king was gone. Some men opened the gates, letting Stannis' forces in. Resistance pockets flared here and there, led by die-hard Lannister loyalists, but they were soon overwhelmed. Tywin Lannister was rumored to be on the march from Harrenhal, but he would arrive too late to save the day. Stannis took the Red Keep, established a tenuous control of the city, and declared himself king of the Undulls and the First Men. The court that formed around him was tense and joyless. There were celebrations for the victory, but they were muted, overshadowed by the knowledge that Lannister forces still roamed the countryside, and that the Tyrells might yet choose to contest Stannis' claim, or at least delay any alliance. For the time being, the realm was thrust into a precarious stalemate. Stannis sat the Iron Throne and named his bannermen to positions of power, but his hold on King's Landing was not absolute. In the hush of the usurped Red Keep, servants whispered legends about the bastard of Winterfell who had ended the reign of the Boy King. Some told the story as if Jon were an avenging hero, delivering the city from a tyrant's cruelty. Others spun darker tales, painting him as a feral northerner who had murdered a child king in cold blood. Rumors soared through the city streets, through taverns and brothels, weaving contradictory myths. Some said Jon was the ghost of Ned Stark come for retribution. Others claimed he was a demon conjured by the Red Sorceress from Dragonstone. None of them matched the reality of a young man who felt equal parts guilt and grim resolve, wandering the corridors of a palace that did not feel like a place he belonged. Jon had been offered chambers within the keep. He accepted them only because he had nowhere else to go. Though spacious and decorated in the gaudy Lannister style, they felt suffocating. Each night, he sat by the narrow window, staring at the blackness over Blackwater Bay, listening to the distant cries of gulls or the scuttle of rats in the walls. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by memories of Joffrey's last gasp and Ned Stark's head upon the block. Occasionally, he crossed paths with Melisandre, the Red Priestess who served Stannis' cause. Her scarlet robes swept across the stone floors like a spill of blood. She often regarded Jon with curious eyes, as though she saw in him something no one else did. "You have the look of the wolf about you," she said once, her voice soft as silk. "But there is something else too, something that does not belong to the north." He did not reply, chilled by her unsettling presence. A flicker of candlelight glimmered in her red eyes, and for an instant, he sensed she knew secrets about him that he himself did not fully grasp. He was not the only newcomer in the keep. Sansa Stark, once betrothed to Joffrey, was still captive within its walls. With the death of Joffrey, her position shifted dangerously. The Lannisters who remained saw her as a potential bargaining chip, and Stannis' new court eyed her as Ned Stark's eldest daughter, a link to the north. Jon's thoughts turned to her often, but he dared not seek her out too openly, for fear of drawing unwelcome attention. He was still uncertain of his own standing in this new power structure. He was not quite a hero nor a prisoner, neither friend nor foe to the Baratheon cause. Yet one afternoon, he steeled himself and ventured through the keep's halls, searching for Sansa. The place was vast and labyrinthine. Eventually, he found himself in a corridor where a handful of guards wearing the stag sigil stood watch. To his surprise, A quiet voice called his name from behind them. The guards parted, revealing a slender young woman in a light blue gown, her auburn hair braided down one shoulder. Sansa Stark looked at Jon with wary eyes, as though trying to recall the boy she once knew. He stepped forward slowly, an ache building in his chest. "Sansa," she curtsied, more out of habit than anything else, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Jon, they told me you were here, that you… She trailed off, clearly unsure how to speak of the regicide. Jon exhaled. "Yes, I did. He wanted to say he was sorry, to apologize for the horror of it, but that felt wrong. "He hurt you," Jon finished quietly. "He hurt our family." She swallowed, tears glistening. "I wanted him dead. Many times I dreamed of it. But now that it's happened, I don't know what to feel. Things were simpler once." A tremor passed through her voice. "Even as a child, I never truly imagined it would come to this." Jon understood. The realm he had once known, the sweet illusions of chivalry and royal courts, had been shattered. "You're free of him," Jon said, "but I don't know if you're truly safe yet. Stannis is no friend of the Lannisters, but you remain important." Her lips pressed into a tight line. "They say my brother, King Robb, is still fighting in the field, that you left the Night's Watch. Will Robb welcome you now?" Jon looked away, shame biting at him. "I've abandoned my vows. Robb might see me as a deserter, or he might not. I don't know. He has so many battles to fight, so many concerns. I've had no word from him." She studied him a moment, as if searching for the boy she recalled in Winterfell's courtyards. Finally, she reached out and briefly touched his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know it was no small thing you did." He looked at her, uncertain. Did she thank him for avenging their father, or for inadvertently freeing her from a nightmare marriage? The truth lay somewhere in the tangled middle, and he realized he could not put words to it. So he merely squeezed her hand, then withdrew. The guards watched warily, but they let him pass. Perhaps they had orders to keep her within these corridors, or perhaps they simply recognized that his presence was sanctioned. In the days that followed, the city adjusted to its new reality. Lawless banners began to appear in various corners, for Melisandre worked tirelessly to spread the faith of the Lord of Light. The people of King's Landing were too tired, too frightened to resist much. Their rightful king, whether Robert's heir or not, was gone, and a new master claimed them. Some adapted, some went underground, some waited for Tywin Lannister's inevitable reprisal. As the swirl of politics deepened, Jon found himself summoned to Stannis's presence. He entered the throne room, feeling the weight of the great hall pressing in around him. The Iron Throne loomed at the far end, a monstrosity of melted swords. Stannis sat upon it, straight-backed, grim as ever. Melisandre stood at his right, her red robes pooling around her feet like fresh blood. Davos stood to the side, arms folded, expression unreadable. A hush fell as Jon approached. His footsteps echoed on the floor. He noticed the battered presence of some of the Stormlords who had thrown in their lot with Stannis. Lords he did not know by name, men with cunning eyes. Then he stood before the throne, a swirl of conflicting emotions weltering inside him. Stannis regarded him with an unflinching gaze. "Jon Snow, you have rendered a great service, whether intended or not. Joffrey Baratheon's death has cracked the Lannister hold on this city." Jon remained silent, unsure how best to respond. Stannis continued, "I have heard many tales of who you might be. You claim the name Snow, yet you carry Valyrian steel. Men say you deserted the Night's Watch. Is that so?" Jon nodded, though it pained him. "I sought answers about my father, about who I am. I do not deny that I broke my vows. I did what I believed was right." A flicker of disapproval crossed Stannis's stern face. "The Night's Watch vow is not lightly broken. Still, these are desperate times, and desperate times call for men of skill. You have proven your prowess." Jon glanced at the floor, wrestling with conflicting loyalties. Melisandre's voice came, low and musical. He is more than a skilled swordsman, your grace. There is power in him. The flames show me visions of a wolf with two faces, one of ice, one of fire. She looked at Jon with curious intensity. Stannis allowed her words to hang in the air before addressing Jon once more. I have need of men I can trust. Some might see you as a criminal for breaking your vows, but none can deny that you rid Westeros of Joffrey Baratheon. That act alone will be a turning point in the war. I am prepared to offer you a place at my side, in my court, if you will swear loyalty to me. Jon's heart pounded. Swear loyalty to Stannis Baratheon? He had been raised to follow Ned Stark's sense of duty, but never had he imagined bending the knee to a man who was not his father's liege. Yet everything had changed. The old ways were fractured. Stannis had, arguably, a better claim to the throne than Joffrey ever did, and he had vowed once to fight for the good of the realm. But what of Robb, or the threat in the north? Jon swallowed. Your grace, my loyalties are torn. My brother Robb is fighting a war. The White Walkers stir beyond the wall. I cannot simply forget all that. Stannis's lips tightened. If you bend the knee, I shall not forbid you from aiding your brother. If the North will declare for me, I will name Robb Warden of the North. And as for these White Walkers, I have heard the rumors. I do not ignore them, but I cannot fight them if the realm tears itself apart in civil war. Jon sensed the gaze of the Red Priestess burning into him. Davos Seaworth looked on with quiet sympathy, as though he knew too well the burdens of honor. For a moment, Jon stared at the Iron Throne, recalling the squeal of metal as Joffrey had perched on its edge, drunk with power. Now Stannis Baratheon sat there, a rigid figure of authority. Jon's father had been loyal to King Robert once. In a twisted way, Stannis was the rightful heir to the Baratheon line. If he could unify the realm, perhaps that was the surest path to defeating the horrors beyond the wall. Slowly, Jon knelt. He felt the eyes of all in the hall upon him. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. I will swear loyalty, your grace, if that loyalty serves the good of the realm. I ask only that you remember the threat from beyond the wall. Stannis rose from the throne, his face solemn. Rise, Jon Snow, and know that I accept your service. When this war is done, we shall see to the wall. In the meantime, you will serve as my sworn sword. You will advise me on matters of the North and lend your strength in the battles to come. Jon stood, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. Once again, he had bound himself with oaths, though these were to a king rather than a watch. He wondered if he was trading one chain for another. Yet a sense of purpose began to stir within him. Perhaps, at last, he might truly act to protect the realm and avenge his family, however complicated the path. A ripple of applause came from the lords assembled, though some looked more puzzled than pleased. King's Bane, they whispered anew, as though the name carried a new authority now that Stannis had acknowledged him. Jon gritted his teeth against the moniker but said nothing. His father's memory was worth more to him than the opinions of courtiers. Over the coming weeks, the city's precarious calm wobbled on the brink of disaster. Stannis sent envoys to treat with the Tyrells, seeking to draw them away from the Lannisters. He issued proclamations to the lords of the North, promising to uphold their rights if they would name him king. The Lannister forces under Tywin lingered at a distance, regrouping. Rumors abounded that the imp, Tyrion Lannister, had gone into hiding somewhere in the city or fled altogether. Cersei Lannister was said to be in the Red Keep still, a prisoner in all but name, stricken with grief and fury at the loss of her son. Jon kept his head down, focusing on the tasks assigned to him, patrolling the city, ensuring the gold cloaks did not stir rebellion, meeting with lords from the north who ventured south, uncertain of their allegiance. He wore a plain surcoat, black as midnight with no sigil. If he noticed the stares that trailed him whenever he passed, he did not respond. At night, he took to the walls of the keep, looking out at the Blackwater and remembering the roaring fires of the battle. He had killed a king. The realm sat in uneasy reflection of that deed, each step forward a consequence of Jon Snow's blade. One evening, as he made his rounds, he encountered Queen Cersei herself, or rather, she encountered him. She was in a secluded courtyard, guarded by 4 of Stannis's men, her golden hair disheveled, her green eyes blazing with a hatred that seemed to sear the air. She wore a gown of deep crimson, though it was wrinkled, as if she had not cared for her appearance in days. Jon stiffened, uncertain whether to bow or stand his ground. The Queen Mother's lips curled in a sneer. "You," she hissed, her voice dripping venom. "You are the one who murdered my son." The guards tensed, but Jon stood unmoving, arms at his sides. "I killed Joffrey in battle," he said quietly. "He was no true king, and he ordered my father's death." Cersei's eyes flared. "He was the rightful king, born of King Robert's seed." She spat the words as though she believed them wholeheartedly, or perhaps needed to. Her voice cracked slightly. "You savage bastard. You have no idea what you've done." Jon felt his jaw clench. "Your son was cruel. He beheaded my father for no crime. He tormented Sansa. He threatened the North with war. All this bloodshed, all this chaos. It began with the Lannisters' betrayal." She laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. "You Starks always pretend to be so righteous. Do you think you're any better than the rest of us? Killing a boy in the halls of his own home." He was not sure what he expected to feel in that moment. Perhaps some triumph in facing the woman who had orchestrated so much misery. But instead, he felt only a cold, weary sorrow. The war was not black and white, nor was life so easily sorted into heroics and villainy. Joffrey was monstrous, yes, but in the end, he was just a boy shaped by a family that thrived on power plays and concealed truths. Cersei's gaze darted to the guards, who stood warily. She let out a slow breath, as if controlling herself by force. Then her face twisted in a twisted half-smile. "I hope you choke on your so-called victory, bastard. The Lannisters will not forget this. My father will not forget. This city will drown in blood before we're done." Jon braced himself against the hatred radiating from her. He could think of nothing to say, so he merely turned and walked away. Her voice followed him, echoing through the courtyard like a curse. "You will die screaming. You and all your wolf kin." In the days after, Cersei's words nagged at Jon, a reminder that the war was far from over. Tywin Lannister's retribution would be slow and methodical, but it would come. If Stannis' claim was to hold, he needed to outmaneuver Tywin or secure an alliance that could match the Lannisters in both cunning and resources. Jon found himself in the War Council more often than not, silently observing as Stannis and his advisors plotted their next moves. Melisandre hovered like a silent shadow, occasionally offering cryptic remarks about the flames, which Stannis considered with stoic seriousness. Davos championed caution and mercy toward the frightened common folk. Jon, when asked, spoke to the mindset of Northern lords, though he had not been raised as their liege and knew only that they valued loyalty and despised the Lannisters for Ned Stark's death. Messengers arrived from the north, bearing tidings. The Boltons played their own game, as always. The Karstarks threatened to break from Robb's cause after certain perceived slights. The Freys, outraged by Robb's broken marriage pact, teetered between betrayal and open rebellion. Meanwhile, rumors spread that Robb Stark had won a series of victories in the west, but his hold was tenuous. Distrust and heartbreak followed him, thanks to alliances broken and savage Lannister raids. Jon was left to wonder how best to bridge the gap between his brother and Stannis. If Robb would but send a letter acknowledging Stannis' right, perhaps they could unite their forces. But there was no guarantee. The North valued its independence, and Robb had already been declared king in the North by his bannermen. Despite all that uncertainty, King's Landing itself began an uneasy return to normal life under the new regime. Markets reopened, albeit sparsely stocked. The streets, once filled with the stench of corpses from the battle, were cleared. Stannis' men established a semblance of order. The Red Keep rang with footsteps of new officials, newly appointed overseers for the city watch, quartermasters for the army, and clerks to manage the flow of ravens. It was during one such day, near dusk, that Jon stood in the courtyard practicing sword forms. He swung Longclaw in a smooth arc, repeating the motion his father's master-at-arms had once taught him. The city air, thick with humidity, clung to his skin. His breath was steady, his mind calm for the first time in ages. He lost himself in the repetition, the discipline of the blade offering a brief respite from the swirling politics. Each slash and thrust reminded him that once he had been just Jon Snow, a boy who wanted only to find his place. Presence approached. Jon turned to see Davos Seaworth watching. The Onion Knight offered a faint smile. "Your form is good," he said. "I've seen men practice in a mindless fashion, but you still have that spark of focus. You keep your blade alive." Jon inclined his head in thanks and lowered Longclaw. "It helps me think." Davos nodded. He folded his arms, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I've just come from the council. Stannis is dispatching an envoy to the Riverlands. He means to treat with Edmure Tully, perhaps even Walder Frey, to see if they'll side with him. He wants you to join this mission, to speak on behalf of the North." Jon hesitated. "Me? Would they not expect a proper lord?" A wry smile curved Davos's mouth. But you're the one who slew Joffrey. Word of that deed carries weight, for good or ill. It might open doors or cause them to slam shut. But Stannis feels your presence might draw attention, show that the North is not blind to his claim." Jon wiped sweat from his brow, pondering. Traveling the Riverlands would bring him closer to the North. It might also bring him face to face with his brother's allies, or even with Robb himself if chance favored it. "I'll go," he said finally, "if it can help the realm avoid further bloodshed, or at least bring us a step closer to uniting. And if I have a chance to speak with my brother." Davos dipped his head. "We sail at first light in a small galley. You'll have a handful of knights and scribes with you, men loyal to Stannis. I'll be coming as well." I suggested to his grace that I might be of use smoothing over rough patches. Jon almost smiled. Davos possessed a diplomacy that Stannis lacked, an honesty that nobles often underestimated. "Then I'll gather my gear," Jon said. "Thank you, Ser Davos." The Onion Knight clasped Jon's forearm, a gesture of camaraderie. "I am no true knight, lad, but you're welcome." That night, Jon prepared his things in a Stark chamber that had once belonged to some lesser Lannister courtier. By candlelight, he packed his meager belongings. He stared at Longclaw, its hilt shaped like a wolf's head, a memory of the Mormonts who had gifted it to him at the wall. He recalled Jeor Mormont's words, "You'll take care of this sword, and you'll pass it on to your children after you." How far he was from that vow, from the man he once thought he would be. Before dawn, he slipped down to the docks. The air smelled of brine and rotting fish. Davos was already there, overseeing the loading of crates filled with supplies for their journey. A handful of armed men stood at attention, wearing the stag sigil. The small galley was unimpressive compared to the warships anchored farther out, but it would suffice for covert travel up the coast, then inland along the waterways. Jon felt a pang of uncertainty. He was leaving behind a city that lay in uneasy calm, a king who demanded his loyalty, and a queen mother who cursed his name. He had not seen Sansa again, though he had left a message that he would do what he could to assure her safety. She was in a strange political limbo, neither prisoner nor guest, valuable to both Stannis and any northern cause. At least she was no longer at the mercy of Joffrey. That would have to be enough for now. He boarded the galley. The crew cast off as dawn's light tinted the eastern sky. They glided out onto the still dark waters of Blackwater Bay. Jon stood on the deck, the wind ruffling his dark curls, and he gazed back at the receding city. The Red Keep's silhouette jutted against the lightning sky, the place where he had spilled royal blood, where so many had died in a single night of fire and steel. A swirl of emotions churned in him, but he let none show on his face. "Farewell, King's Landing," Davos murmured at his side. "May the next time we see you, you're still in one piece." Jon watched in silence as the city shrank behind them. He wondered if fate would ever allow him to live a quiet life again, free from battles and crowns and the ghosts of those he'd slain. Probably not. The memory of Joffrey's last breath still lingered, a turning point that had set the realm on a new course, for better or worse. They navigated the bay, heading north. Jon cast his mind toward the Riverlands, where the next chapter of this unfolding saga would be written. He wanted to find Robb. Perhaps they could combine their forces with Stannis. Perhaps they could secure the realm before the worst threats arrived from the far north. Perhaps they could find a way to bring justice and peace. Or maybe all of Westeros would be devoured by war, peace by bloody peace. Morning sun broke over the waves, gilding the water with the promise of a new day. Jon lifted his face to the light, trying to let go of the darkness he'd left behind in the City of Kings. The gulls cried overhead, a reminder that life went on, heedless of men's ambitions. And so he sailed into uncertainty, a bastard from Winterfell, a deserter of the Night's Watch, the slayer of a king, carrying the realm's fragile hopes on his sword arm. He did not know where the path would lead. He only knew that the events set into motion by Joffrey's death would shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Tywin Lannister would not surrender, the Tyrells would weigh their alliances, and the North would not kneel so easily. But for now, Jon Snow had chosen his course. He would serve King Stannis, work to unite the realm, and pray the true war. The war against the icy darkness beyond the wall did not catch them all unprepared. Somewhere in the swirling seaborne breeze, Jon thought he caught a whisper of ghost, distant and lonely. He gripped the rail, staring ahead. The weight of destiny pressed upon his shoulders, cold and unyielding as the northern snows. He had slain a king and changed the succession of the Iron Throne. He had killed in the name of House Stark and justice. Wherever this path might lead him, there could be no turning back. So he set his jaw, steeled his heart, and let the ship carry him forward, into the rising sun of a future none could yet foresee. The small galley cut across the calm waters with a gentle hiss, its sails half-furled to catch the faint wind that drifted along the coast. The dawn sky blushed with the first light of day, clouds tinted in shades of pink and gold. A quiet hush lay over the deck as the crew performed their tasks with subdued efficiency, careful not to stir anyone to undue alarm along the shoreline. They were not traveling in grand procession. They moved as discreetly as a boat bearing an official envoy could, alert to the danger that might wait beyond every bend of the coast. Jon Snow stood near the prow, face angled toward the breeze, his gloved fingers resting on the ship's wooden rail. He wore simple leathers, dyed in the Baratheon black for the journey, though he still refused any sigil. He was no true Baratheon man. He had pledged himself to Stannis only out of necessity and a faint hope that uniting the realm might spare it from worse horrors. The dagger of guilt remained lodged in his soul, lodged since the moment he had driven Longclaw through the heart of Joffrey Baratheon in the smoky halls of the Red Keep. For some in King's Landing, that act was a deliverance from a monstrous boy-king. For others, it was a grievous sin never to be forgiven. Jon could not quiet the memory of Joffrey's last, strangled breaths. At the same time, he could not pretend remorse for removing a tyrant whose cruelty had wrecked so many lives, including that of Ned Stark, the man Jon had called father. Still, the weight of it lingered. A kingslayer, even of a false king, could not so easily shrug off that heavy mantle. Davos Seaworth appeared by his side, the Onion Knight's features creased with empathy. Despite the salt and pepper stubble on his cheeks and the faint lines around his eyes, he moved with the vigor of a younger man. "We'll be veering inland soon," Davos said, gesturing ahead to where the coastline curved, opening into the broad mouth of a river that spread like dark wine into the sea. "A short trek upriver, and we'll keep to calmer waters." The men who guard these shores might not expect a small galley, especially not one with a Baratheon banner stowed rather than flown. Jon's gaze followed Davos's gesture. The coastline was thick with green, though it was the battered green of autumn's edge, soon to be touched by winter's first chill. The Riverlands had seen war after war, armies marching through its fields and forests. Robb Stark had won victories here, back when the young wolf seemed unstoppable. Now, with all the shifting alliances and disasters, who knew how the local lords would greet an envoy from Stannis Baratheon? "Have you traveled these parts before?" Jon asked quietly. Davos nodded. "In my smuggling days, I never lingered, but I carried onions and salted fish upriver to small towns along the banks. That was years ago, before the realm fell into chaos. Times have changed. People here have lost crops, loved ones, and any sense of safety. I expect them to greet us with suspicion at best." Jon sighed. Suspicion is the norm these days. The only sure greeting is steel. They fell silent. Overhead, a flock of pale gulls wheeled, their keening cries echoing across the waves. Jon's thoughts strayed to the war councils in King's Landing, to the hunched figure of Stannis upon the Iron Throne, brow knit in perpetual sternness. The crowned stag held the city now, yet Tywin Lannister was still in the field, and the Tyrells remained a perilous question mark. Who would they back, if anyone? And what of Jon's own brother, Robb, the king in the north, still waging war against the Lannisters who had once held Sansa hostage and cast Ned Stark's head upon the spikes? Jon felt a churn of longing at the thought of Robb. The sense of being out of place in the south had never truly left him, even when serving in the Night's Watch. He was a wolf without a pack, fighting a war that sometimes seemed 1,000 leagues removed from the real threat beyond the wall. And yet here he stood, sworn to Stannis, traveling beneath that banner. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was a bitter cosmic jest. The hours passed in quiet vigilance. The small galley angled into the wide estuary, leaving the open sea behind. The rolling waves gave way to calmer waters edged with tall reeds and muddy banks. Here and there, small villages or fishing outposts came into view, their inhabitants gathering at the river's edge to watch the strangers sail by. Some scattered at the sight, retreating into huts or behind half-collapsed walls. Others merely stared, expressions etched with weariness and distrust. An afternoon haze settled over the water, turning the sky a flat, silvery gray. Jon occasionally felt the crew's eyes upon him, as if waiting for him to speak or give orders. But he had no commands to issue. Davos was the one in charge of their navigation and their approach. Jon was there to lend the weight of his name, King's Bane, they called him, and the sense that his northern ties could coax Robb Stark's supporters or the scattered riverlords to consider Stannis' cause. He disliked the theatrics of it, but saw no other way. If bending the knee to Stannis was the surest route to forging alliances, then so be it. At sunset, they pulled into a sheltered bend of the river, where a small orchard of willow trees hung over the bank. The galley anchored in shallow water, close enough to reach land with a plank. The men set about making camp quietly, each looking about with a measure of unease. The Riverlands were infamous for raids and outlaws in this tumultuous period, and they had no illusions that wearing a Baratheon badge offered perfect safety. Only about 20 men were with them, hardly enough to fight off a large band of marauders. But secrecy was more valuable than a show of force here, or so Davos believed. They built a small fire beneath the canopy of willow, the night breeze teasing its branches into a soft rustle. One of the knights, Ser Colin, roasted salted pork on a spit while another handed out dried bread. Jon sat on a fallen log, eating without appetite. Across from him, Davos spoke in low tones to 3 men who would ride out at first light to scout the roads ahead. They had to determine which lords might still hold these lands, or at least which soldiers might be patrolling them. Word was that Edmure Tully remained at Riverrun, having retaken the castle after his father's death. But the Riverlands were splintered by the brutality of the conflict, and no traveler could be certain who ruled one stretch of land versus the next. When the meal ended, the men sorted into groups to keep watch during the night. Jon volunteered to take the darkest hours of the watch, from midnight until the dawn. He laid out a bedroll near the flickering embers, closed his eyes, and tried to sleep for a few hours. In restless dreams, he saw King's Landing under a green sky of wildfire. He saw Joffrey's face, twisted in the final throes of death, and then he saw Ned Stark's ghost, standing upon the ramparts of Winterfell, gazing north. It was not the kingslaying that shook Jon so much as the sense of irreversible change. When he awoke, sweat dampened his brow and his heart thudded against his ribs, as if a shadow lingered at the edges of his awareness. He rose carefully, buckling on his sword belt. The camp was quiet. One of the knights, a lean man called Ser Bennis, dozed by the embers with his helmet in his lap. Another man paced the perimeter, carrying a lantern. Jon took a torch and moved out toward the edge of the willow grove to begin his turn at watch. The moon was high, silvering the gently rippling water. The river looked deceptively peaceful, but Jon could not forget the devastation that war had inflicted upon these lands. He spent his watch in silent vigilance, occasionally glimpsing a flash of movement along the distant shore, perhaps wildlife or an outlaw, or just his imagination conjuring shapes in the darkness. Morning arrived cold and gray, a fine drizzle filtering through the willow leaves. They broke camp and rode ashore to stable ground, bringing the horses that had been lashed in the galley's small hold. The craft would remain at anchor, guarded by a handful of sailors who would keep it secure for a return journey. Meanwhile, Davos, Jon, and their small retinue mounted up to journey deeper inland. They followed a narrow dirt track, flanked by reeds and fallow fields, passing farmsteads that looked half-abandoned. Occasionally they saw ragged peasants in the distance, but few dared approach. The bruises of war showed in burned-out huts, broken fences, and the deep fear in the eyes of those they glimpsed. Jon felt a knot of anger coil in his belly, remembering well that all these miseries stemmed from the game for the Iron Throne. A game he was now caught up in, for better or worse. By midday, the drizzle had subsided. The riders made decent time, pausing only to water the horses at a small stream. Davos carried sealed letters from King Stannis, bearing the royal seal, to present to the local lords. But first they had to find someone to receive them. The roads were empty, suspiciously so, as if war had left the region barren of any standing guard. That in itself set the knights on edge. They pressed on until twilight. At last, they spotted a ramshackle tower standing amid a stretch of farmland gone to weeds. A half-dozen men-at-arms loitered near the tower's front gate, wearing mismatched pieces of mail. At the sight of the approaching riders, these men hoisted their spears and called out a challenge. Davos rode ahead, raising one hand in a sign of parley. The men, suspicious, let him draw near but kept their weapons at the ready. Jon remained a pace behind, scanning the area. He saw a worn banner drooping from the top of the tower's single rampart. It looked like a faded sigil, perhaps a blue heron or crane, but time and weather had bleached it too heavily to tell for certain. One of the men, burly and bald, scowled from beneath a battered steel cap. "Who are you, traveling this road with swords at the ready?" His accent was pure Riverlands, thick with suspicion. Davos kept his tone civil. "I am Davos Seaworth, in service to King Stannis Baratheon, the rightful king of Westeros. We are envoys seeking safe passage and the courtesy of your lord, if he still holds this tower." The man spat at the ground. "King Stannis? That's a new one. Last I heard, the boy king in King's Landing still reigned." Jon tensed. Davos only answered calmly, "Joffrey Baratheon is dead, good sir. King Stannis took the city." A murmur rippled among the men. The burly guard's scowl deepened, as though he suspected a lie or a trick. "We've heard no such tidings," he said flatly. "And you lot are but a handful. Why should we believe you?" "Because it's the truth," Jon said quietly, riding forward a step. He could feel their eyes flick to him, and he saw how some recognized the Valyrian steel sword at his hip. Joffrey died at the Battle of the Blackwater, struck down by northern steel. Another stir went through the guards. One man glanced at Jon's face as if he recognized him from some rumor carried across the war-torn land. Jon resisted the urge to grimace. Word had traveled faster than formal declarations, it seemed. Davos offered a small parchment scroll, the wax seal plainly visible even in the dimming light. "Here is King Stannis's letter, bearing his seal. If your lord or captain can read, he may confirm our words." The bald guard looked uncertain, glancing at his fellows. After a pause, he jerked his head toward the gate. "Stay here. I'll fetch the captain." Minutes trickled by. The drizzle of earlier in the day had left the air chilly. Indeed, the overcast sky promised a damp night. Finally, the guard returned with an older man sporting a patchy gray beard. He wore a rusted breastplate and carried himself with a weary dignity. "Captain Lucan," he identified himself. "I hold this tower in Lord Vance's name, though the Lord himself left months ago to fight in the war. We've had no news, no supplies. If you come in peace, we can talk." Davos dismounted, extending the parchment once more. "Thank you, Captain. We'd be grateful for the chance to speak with you, share news, and perhaps purchase shelter for the night." Captain Lucan accepted the parchment but held it gingerly, as though uncertain it was anything but a piece of worthless paper. "We're poor hosts these days, smuggler, but I'll see what we can do." He turned and led them within the small courtyard. It was crowded with broken carts, a few half-starved chickens, and a pair of scrawny mules tethered to a post. The tower rose 3 stories above them with arrow slits for windows. The men-at-arms present numbered fewer than a dozen, and they looked exhausted, eyes sunken from meager rations and endless worry. This was the state of many lesser holdings in the Riverlands, left to fend for themselves while lords fought on distant fields. Davos guided the knights in removing their horses' bridles, allowing them to graze on the sparse patches of grass. Jon dismounted and followed Davos inside, ducking through the narrow entry of the tower. The interior smelled of damp straw and stale air. Captain Lucan led them up a winding staircase to a small hall. A single candle guttered on a rough wooden table. Lucan laid the parchment down. "I can read a bit," he muttered, squinting. "But these eyes are not what they used to be." Davos stepped forward. "May I?" At the captain's nod, Davos read the letter aloud carefully. A formal announcement from Stannis Baratheon that the Iron Throne was now under his rightful kingship, that Joffrey Baratheon was slain in battle, and that the realm was called upon to rally beneath the banner of the true king. When Davos finished, Lucan stared at the guttering candle. "Is it all true? Joffrey dead?" "Yes," Jon said quietly. "I was there. He died by my sword." Lucan's eyes flicked to Jon, sharpened with a curiosity tinged by caution. "And who might you be?" Jon hesitated, aware that his name carried a burden. "Jon Snow, formerly of the Night's Watch, now sworn to King Stannis. My father was Eddard Stark." He rarely spoke the words, for they reopened the raw wound of Ned Stark's death. Lucan's gaze softened slightly at the name, for Ned Stark was remembered with respect in most corners of the Seven Kingdoms, particularly by men who valued honesty. "So it's come to this," the captain murmured. "A bastard of Ned Stark, slaying the Lannister boy king. And now you want us to serve King Stannis." Davos dipped his head. "We understand your resources are few. We don't demand immediate fealty. But if there's any way to open your gates or pass word that King Stannis stands ready to restore order, it could save needless bloodshed later." Lucan let out a breath. "You'll find no love for the Lannisters here. They marched through these lands more than once, leaving ruin in their wake. I doubt Lord Vance would have any fondness for them either. But as for bending the knee to Stannis, my lord would likely wait to see if Robb Stark unites with him or not. The Tullys might have a say too. We've heard Edmure Tully is again holding Riverrun, but who knows for how long. There are frays about, too, none we trust." He shook his head. "We are caught between fear of Tywin Lannister and the uncertain promise of your king. I know not which is worse." Jon said, "Tywin's wrath is fearsome, but better that than to keep a false peace with those who murdered Lord Vance's allies. Tywin will spare no man who stands against him. Yet if we unite, we might hold him at bay." Lucan sighed. "You speak sense, but I only command a handful of men. What can we do but keep the gates locked against bandits and worse? Still, you may stay the night, break bread with us in the morning. I ask that your knights remain civil. We've nothing left to steal, mind you." Davos placed a respectful hand over his heart. "We appreciate your hospitality, Captain. We'll cause no trouble here." And so they spent the night beneath a leaking roof in the tower's cramped hall, feasting, if one could call it that, on thin stew made of beans, onions, and a few bits of stringy goat. Jon ate in reflective silence, absorbing all he could of the local men's talk. They spoke of burned villages along the Red Fork, of roving gangs of sellswords turned bandits, of hungry small folk forced to forage in the woods. They spoke the name Blackwater with trembling resentment, rumored to be leading raiding parties under the Fry banner. They muttered about Roose Bolton's men wearing flayed man sigils and sowing terror across certain areas. The Riverlands had become a tapestry of nightmares, each corner overshadowed by the ravages of war. John excused himself after eating and climbed the stairs to an alcove that overlooked the courtyard. A narrow archer's slit allowed a view of the dark sky, scattered with faint stars. He watched a moment, remembering how Winterfell's sky looked on cold, clear nights, the constellations so bright they seemed to pierce your soul. Here, clouds hung low, muffling the light. He could taste the damp in the air, the promise of yet more rain. Down below, he heard quiet talking. Davos was likely sharing news with the men or gleaning more intelligence about local movements. The knights who traveled with them had settled in for rest, grateful for any roof. Even in a ruinous tower, a bit of shelter was better than an open camp in the wilderness. Fatigue weighed on John. The events of the last weeks had left him with a constant ache in his bones, a restlessness in his mind. Killing Joffrey felt like both a distant memory and a fresh wound. He wondered if Robb Stark had heard the news yet, if word had reached him that a bastard brother he had once bid farewell at Winterfell had slain the tyrant responsible for their father's death. Would it make a difference in the war? Would it heal the rift that parted them? John could not say. And Sansa, what would become of her under Stannis' watch in King's Landing? At least she was no longer a hostage of a sadistic boy king. But she remained a political pawn, and John worried that Stannis might try to use her to coax northern lords into swearing fealty. Perhaps that was the price for forging alliances. He could only pray that any such arrangement would leave Sansa safe. He leaned against the cold stone, letting exhaustion creep through him. When he finally returned to the hall to sleep, the night offered only haunted dreams, flashes of the wall's endless expanse of ice and the swirl of white walkers under a black sky. A silent dread pressed in on him, the reminder that while men slaughtered each other in the south, an inhuman enemy stirred in the far north. Sometimes he saw the faces of wildlings he had slain, and sometimes he heard the mournful howl of a dire wolf echoing across ghostly snowdrifts. In all those visions, he sensed the chill presence of something older and darker than the petty cruelties of mortal men. Morning found the tower roused early, men complaining of stiff joints and empty stomachs. Captain Lucan mustered what courtesy he could. He provided bread and watered wine for the departing travelers, then urged them to ride west if they meant to seek Riverrun or any of the Tully bannermen. "The roads near the Trident are less dangerous than those deeper south," he said, "though that isn't saying much. Keep your eyes open." Davos thanked him. They rode out soon after sunrise, forging carefully along the road that led to a crossing of the Red Fork. From there, they would make a decision. Turn north to see if they might find allies of Robb Stark, or continue west toward Riverrun in search of Edmure Tully. The matter remained unresolved until midday, when they halted by a half-collapsed inn near a battered signpost. One of the scouts dismounted and peered at the faded lettering. "Riverrun is half a day that way," he said, pointing down a muddy track. "North would take us near the Twins, though that's ill-advised. The Freys are not known for kindly welcomes these days." Davos stroked his beard. "Riverrun may be the more direct route. We have letters for Edmure Tully, after all. And if by chance Robb Stark is in communication with him, we might hear word of the king in the north." He glanced at John, who stood holding his horse's reins. "Unless you'd rather we risk going north to seek your brother directly." John frowned. He had no particular desire to test the Freys' hospitality, especially after hearing the rumors about their raids and treachery. Even if some among them supported Robb, the friction between Robb and Walder Frey was legendary by now. Broken betrothals, resentments, talk of betrayal. "Let's go to Riverrun," John said. "It's safer, or at least more straightforward. If Edmure Tully is indeed holding the castle, he may be able to arrange a meeting with Robb. Or at the very least, we can glean more recent news." So they pressed west, passing farmland that was slightly less scarred than the territory they had traveled through before. Here, the land had changed hands multiple times in the war, But now it seemed calmer, as though hostilities had moved farther afield. They saw more people, farmers in the distance tending half-grown fields, small groups of travelers hauling battered carts, children who peered out from behind hedgerows. Some waved in cautious greeting, others darted away. Clearly, the villagers had learned to fear armed companies. By the time the sun dipped low, they came upon a larger settlement. 2 rows of houses flanking the road, with an alehouse near the center. Smoke curled from a handful of chimneys, and a small watchtower overlooked a wooden palisade. The banner fluttering there was a red trout on a blue field, the sigil of House Tully. The gates were open, though guarded by men wearing threadbare surcoats that bore the trout. The guards stiffened at the sight of unknown riders, but Jon and Davos raised their hands in peace. In short order, they were escorted into the village. An older guard introduced himself as Mathis, a local retainer of the Tullis who had been left to keep order here when Edmure reclaimed Riverrun. He led them into the alehouse, where the wooden tables were scratched and the rushes on the floor had seen better days. The smell of cooked cabbage clung to the air. A fire crackled in a hearth set against one wall. Settling in, Davos explained they were envoys from King Stannis and that they wished to meet Edmure at Riverrun, bearing letters of invitation and alliance. Mathis was a thin, wiry man with iron-gray hair bound in a messy tail. He listened with a stoic expression. When Davos finished, the old retainer nodded. "I can take you to Riverrun, or at least show you the way. Lord Edmure has been working hard to rebuild the region, trying to reclaim what the Lannisters burned. But he'll want to hear about King Stannis' new rule in King's Landing, if he'll believe it. We've had no ravens from the capital in weeks." Davos smiled. "We'd be grateful for your guidance. We can leave tomorrow if that suits you." Mathis agreed, then gestured for a barmaid to bring a round of ale for the newly arrived knights. Conversation in the alehouse was subdued, but not unfriendly. A few locals paused to stare at the armed visitors, but the presence of Tully men seemed to reassure them, and soon they went back to muttering about the harvest and the threat of bandits. Jon sat near a corner with his back to the wall, sipping carefully at the ale. The night wore on, and eventually they found lodging in a barn near the edge of the village, with straw for bedding. It was better than sleeping in the rain. Early the next morning, they rode out under Mathis's guidance. The terrain became gently rolling, with meadows and hedgerows, occasional stands of oak or ash. Gradually, as the day progressed, they began to notice more Tully banners posted at crossroads and more signs that local villages were being rebuilt. A few times they passed small columns of Edmure's soldiers, looking half-trained but earnest. It appeared that Edmure Tully had, indeed, secured some semblance of control around Riverrun, though the scars of war still lingered. By late afternoon, they reached a point where the Red Fork's banks grew broad and slow, and there in the distance rose the stout walls and towers of Riverrun, a castle shaped by 3 converging rivers, its defenses both natural and man-made. Jon recalled hearing stories of Riverrun's beauty and strength from old Winterfell men-at-arms, but he had never seen it himself. Even from afar, he could tell it was a fortress of strategic value, a proud seat of House Tully that had withstood numerous sieges over centuries. They approached at a measured pace. The main drawbridge was lowered, guarded by men bearing Tully's red trout upon their tabards. Banners fluttered above the walls in the late-day breeze. On the ramparts, watchmen stood with crossbows, scanning the horizon. As Davos's party neared, they hailed the walls, sending Mathis forward to announce them. A short exchange followed, then the gates creaked open. The courtyard beyond was busy with activity. Laborers hauling crates of supplies, horses being led to stables, a cluster of washers beating clothes in wooden tubs. Soldiers in Tully livery milled about, some carrying halberds, others with swords belted at the waist. The keep itself rose at the far side, a tower built of reddish stone that caught the glow of the afternoon sun. Although certain corners showed scorch marks and damage from earlier sieges, the castle radiated a sturdy resilience that spoke to House Tully's determination. A small retinue awaited them. 10 men in plate and mail, led by a tall knight with a trimmed auburn beard. As Davos and Jon dismounted, the knight stepped forward. I am Ser Desmond Grell, Master-at-Arms of Riverrun. Mathis tells us you bear letters from King Stannis. Is that correct? Davos handed him the sealed scroll, repeating his well-practiced introduction. Ser Desmond read the words, his face an unreadable mask. Then he looked up. This is a heavy claim, he said quietly. If King Joffrey is truly dead, that changes many things. Jon stepped forward. He is dead. I was the one who struck him down. He knew these words would never grow easier to say. Ser Desmond's eyes swept over Jon, clearly noting his Stark-like features. Then you would be the one they're calling Kingsbane. A strange twist, but these are strange times indeed. He gestured for them to follow. Come with me. Lord Edmure will want to hear this in person. They walked through the courtyard. Jon observed a small garden along one wall, where hardy autumn flowers still bloomed. The moat that ran around two sides of the castle sparkled in the sun, fed by the parted rivers. Archers watched from elevated positions, their eyes trained on the new arrivals. Ahead loomed the doors of the great hall. Servants hurried to pull them open, revealing a warm interior lit by torches and windows of colored glass. Inside, Edmure Tully sat upon a dais in a simple wooden seat, wearing a surcoat of blue with the Tully fish embroidered across the chest. He was younger than Jon expected for a ruling lord, with reddish hair only a shade lighter than his sister Catelyn's, though lines of care were etched around his eyes. A handful of advisors and guards flanked him. The hall was modestly decorated, signs of recent refurbishments evident in the new tapestries that hung next to old ones still half-burned. A hush settled as Davos, Jon, and their companions advanced across the flagstone floor. Desmond Grell bowed. My lord, these envoys come from King Stannis Baratheon in King's Landing. Edmure's gaze flicked from Davos to Jon, then back to the scroll in Desmond's hand. A mixture of tension and curiosity crossed his face. Welcome to Riverrun, he said at last. I am Edmure Tully, son of Hoster Tully, Lord of Riverrun by my father's passing. His voice held a note of the courtesy that had once made House Tully respected. What news from the capital? Davos bowed. My lord, I am Davos Seaworth, hand to King Stannis Baratheon. With me is Jon Snow, the man who ended the life of Joffrey Baratheon and helped Stannis take the city. We bear letters for you, if it pleases you to read them. Edmure blinked, plainly startled. So the boy king is truly dead? Jon inclined his head. Yes, my lord. He fell at the Battle of the Blackwater. King Stannis's forces now hold King's Landing. A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled courtiers. Edmure exhaled slowly, his eyes darting around as though to measure the gravity of this news. 7 save us, he muttered. I had word that Stannis was besieging the city, but no raven confirmed the outcome. So Joffrey is gone. He shifted in his seat, struggling to steady himself. This is momentous indeed. May the gods judge him. Davos stepped closer. King Stannis sends his greetings, Lord Edmure, and hopes that the Riverlands will join him in restoring order to the realm. He offers you a place in his councils, if you will swear fealty. He seeks to mend the wounds left by the Lannisters, and to unite the lords of Westeros against any who would threaten the realm. Edmure's mouth twitched. Such an offer has many implications. You must know that my niece, Sansa Stark, was wed to the Lannisters, that my sister, Lady Catelyn, still stands with her son Robb, king in the north. The Tullys are bound to the Starks by blood and marriage, and I've no fondness for the Iron Throne after what it's done. So this invitation puts me in a difficult position. Jon spoke carefully. My lord, I too share that blood. Eddard Stark raised me, though I was born a bastard. I understand the loyalties that bind you to the north, and to Robb in particular. But consider that Stannis might yet be the best chance for peace, and the surest way to see justice done for our families, so long wronged by the Lannisters. Edmure's gaze fell on Jon with a complicated mix of wariness and empathy. You speak of justice, having slain Joffrey yourself. Perhaps that is justice, indeed. He paused, weighing something unspoken. What of Robb? Have you spoken with him? Does Stannis propose some alliance with the king in the north? Davos nodded. We do propose precisely that. We desire nothing more than that Robb Stark and Stannis Baratheon set aside any rivalry, so they can stand together. We all know the Lannisters will not go quietly. Tywin Lannister still commands a formidable host. And there are other factions, some might side with the Tyrells, some might splinter off entirely. If the realm remains divided, it only prolongs the bloodshed. Edmure was silent for a time, fingertips drumming against the arm of his seat. The murmurs among his advisors quieted. Then he said, Robb has been away in the field, battling the remnants of Lannister forces to the west. Last I heard, he was near the crag, making inroads against the Lannisters' flank. Communication is difficult at best. We've had ravens, but they arrive sporadically, and half are lost or shot down. A wry twist shaped Davos's lips. So we cannot simply send a raven and expect swift reply. But if Robb values your counsel, perhaps he would heed a summons from you to treat here, or at some agreed-upon location, to hear King Stannis's terms. Edmure's gaze trailed across the hell, eventually settling on Jon. You wear no crown, Jon Snow, but many say your single deed has altered the course of this war. If Robb is to be persuaded that Stannis means to uphold northern honor, your presence might help. Can I trust that Stannis will not attempt to force the North to bend the knee under threat? Jon cleared his throat. Stannis wants the North as part of the Seven Kingdoms, yes. But he has told me that if we can secure peace, and if the North stands with him, he would name Robb Warden of the North and confirm all ancient rights. The alternative is more bloodshed with no certain outcome, and the realm cannot withstand endless war. Edmure closed his eyes briefly, perhaps recalling the losses his house had suffered. His father, his armies, the dire toll upon his people. Finally, he drew himself up with decision. Then I will write to Robb, urging him to come to Riverrun for a council of our own. If he proves willing, we can host a representative from King Stannis. If that is acceptable. Davos exchanged a glance with Jon, then nodded. More than acceptable, my lord. I will gladly remain here as Stannis's envoy, if that would help facilitate the meeting. Jon Snow may wish to journey on or stay, whatever best serves the cause of unity. Jon's throat constricted at the possibility of reuniting with Robb. He realized how deeply he longed to see his brother again, if only to speak of the heartbreak they had shared. The image of Robb's face the day Jon rode for the wall surfaced in his mind. They had parted as boys, each stepping into roles they had never expected. Now they were something else entirely. A sworn sword to King Stannis and a king in the north, separated by miles and an ocean of blood. I will remain, Jon said quietly. I wish to see Robb if he'll come. Edmure offered a faint, sincere smile. Then we shall do our best to see that happen. I'll have a raven prepared at once. He looked at his steward, a lanky man with ink-stained fingers, who nodded and hurried off to pen the letter. Then Edmure rose from his seat, extending a hand toward Davos. You are guests of Riverrun. We've not the lavish feasts of old, but what we have you shall share. A sense of cautious optimism stirred the hall. The men who traveled with Davos and Jon visibly relaxed, removing their gloves and loosening sword belts in a gesture of trust. Riverrun's guards, too, seemed less tense, though none forgot that alliances in these days could shift like quicksand. For the next few days, Jon found himself an uneasy courtier in Edmure's hall. Servants gave him wide berth, some glancing in awe or fear. The rumor of his deed slaying Joffrey had preceded him. Some declared it righteous vengeance for Ned Stark. Others whispered that it was a terrible sin to kill a king, no matter the justification. Jon did his best to appear humble, always mindful that he was an outsider here. Yet, courtesy was not lacking. The Tullys had long prided themselves on hospitality, and Edmure was determined to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Davos spent long hours in conversation with Edmure, discussing matters of strategy, supply lines, the state of the war, and the possibility that House Tyrell might yet tilt the balance in any direction. Edmure was more concerned about the immediate threat of Lannister or Frey vengeance. especially if Tywin learned that Riverrun was entertaining envoys from Stannis. Now that Joffrey was gone, the lines of succession were uncertain. Tommen might be proclaimed by some as the next Lannister-backed king, or Myrcella, or any puppet Tywin preferred to foist upon the realm. None of it changed the fact that Tywin commanded enough men to remain a lethal force. Jon, for his part, walked the ramparts, gazing down at the swirling rivers. He tried to imagine the day Robb might ride through Riverrun's gates, banners snapping in the wind, gray wind at his side. Would his brother welcome him or condemn him for breaking his vows to the Night's Watch? The memory of that vow still pricked Jon's conscience. He had pledged never to take part in the wars of the realm, to hold no lands, no titles. But that vow felt like a relic of a time before the world turned upside down, before White Walkers stirred in the north and the realm tore itself apart. In quiet moments, Jon also thought of Sansa. She had been a prisoner in King's Landing, betrothed to Joffrey, then forced into who knew what else. He had heard she might be wed to Tyrion Lannister or was forced into some fleeting betrothal. He wasn't sure. The swirl of rumors was thick. At least now, with Stannis in control of the city, she was out of Joffrey's reach. But that did not mean she was free. Stannis was not cruel like Joffrey, but he was iron-willed, and the Game of Thrones demanded hostages, alliances, and strategic marriages. Jon could only hope Sansa would not be subjected to more suffering. Another letter arrived at Riverrun a few days later, this one from the Freys. Edmure read it with a scowl, then tossed it aside. Walder Frey complains that we allow bandits to roam near his crossing. He wants more men to help patrol. The nerve. Davos cleared his throat. Is that a true complaint? Or is it a pretext for sending his own troops into your lands? Likely the latter, Edmure muttered. Old Walder's alliances shift with the wind. He'll do anything if it profits him. Jon listened quietly from where he stood by a window, arms crossed. He had heard tales of Walder Frey's bitterness and cunning, how Robb had angered him by failing to uphold a marriage pact. The talk of bandits might be a veiled threat or a gambit. Will you concede his request? Jon asked. Edmure snorted. Not unless I fancy inviting a viper into my bed. But I'll have to pen some polite refusal, or else risk an immediate break with the Freys. At least until Robb arrives. I'll tread carefully. That was the heart of it. Everyone was waiting for the king in the north. Days turned into a week, then two, as the men of Riverrun busied themselves with repairs and fortifications. Jon sparred with some of Edmure's soldiers in the courtyard, keeping his sword arm sharp. They asked him about the battle at King's Landing, wide-eyed as children listening to a fireside tale. He gave them only the barest details. Each time they pressed him to describe how it felt to run a blade through Joffrey Baratheon. Jon grew silent. The truth was complicated. Even if he believed it had been a just act, it still haunted him. The idea of taking satisfaction in it seemed grotesque. And yet that single deed cast him into the center of the realm's fate. Perhaps it was the will of the old gods or the new or none at all. Whatever the cause, here he stood, awaiting a moment that might unite the realm or splinter it further. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across Riverrun's courtyard, a horn sounded from the ramparts. Jon hurried to the battlements, heart pounding. In the golden light beyond the walls, a column of riders approached, dust curling at their feet. Blue and gray banners snapped in the wind, unmistakable in their design. The direwolf of House Stark, the leaping trout of House Tully. Jon's pulse throbbed. Could only be Robb. Edmure raced to the gatehouse, beckoning men to open the drawbridge. Jon stood behind him, tension coiling in every muscle. As the riders crossed into the courtyard, Jon recognized the tall, broad-shouldered figure in the lead. Robb Stark, clad in mail and leather, a fur-trimmed cloak at his back, his hair auburn and thick around a face that looked older, harder than Jon remembered. Next to him loped a great gray direwolf, gray wind, eyes gleaming gold and ears pricked with alert. Following Robb were a mix of northern bannermen, Karstarks, Glovers, Malisters, and some Riverland knights. A hush fell across the yard as they reined in their horses. Robb dismounted in a fluid motion, turning to greet Edmure with a grim smile. "Uncle," he said, clasping Edmure's forearm. Then his gaze drifted over the courtyard, the tension in his posture palpable. He spotted Davos, who stood aside with the Baratheon knights, and then his eyes landed on Jon. For a moment, time seemed to stop. They stared at each other, two men who had been boys together in Winterfell's courtyards, sparring with wooden swords and laughing over shared jokes. Now the ravages of war lay heavy on them both. Jon could see lines of grief on Robb's face. Grief for their father, for the countless dead. Robb took a step forward, almost hesitant, and Grey Wind followed, sniffing the air. "Jon," Robb said, voice catching slightly. Jon managed a nod, his throat tight. "Robb." Grey Wind padded closer, muzzle lifted to scent Jon's clothing. The dire wolf let out a soft chuff, neither aggressive nor frightened, merely curious. Jon slowly extended a hand, remembering how Ghost had once greeted Robb with playful nips. The sorrow of that memory twisted inside him. He had lost track of Ghost after fleeing the Night's Watch. Robb studied his brother for a moment longer. Then they embraced, a brief but fierce clasp of arms in the silent courtyard. When they separated, Robb cleared his throat, trying to recapture a kingly composure. "I received your letter," he said to Edmure, "and I rode with all haste once I understood what was at stake." His gaze swept to Davos and the others. "So, King Stannis holds King's Landing, and you come with offers of alliance." Davos dipped his head respectfully. "Yes, your grace. I am Davos Seaworth, hand to King Stannis Baratheon. We wish to see the realm united beneath the rightful king, and we hope you will meet with us to discuss terms that might benefit the North, the Riverlands, and indeed all the Seven Kingdoms." Robb listened, expression guarded. His eyes flickered to Jon. "I see my brother stands at your side." Jon felt the weight of that statement. "I swore myself to Stannis because I believed it was right for the realm, Robb. I don't deny that I broke my vows to the Night's Watch. The realm is in chaos, and we need unity. Stannis was my best path to that." Robb's jaw tensed, though not in outright anger, more like sorrow. "We'll speak of that later," he said quietly. Then, raising his voice so the courtyard could hear, he proclaimed, "Let all men know I am here in peace, to speak with my uncle and with these envoys. No harm shall be done under my protection." The words carried the ring of authority, and the men around him relaxed slightly. Edmure stepped forward, a relieved smile crossing his face. "Welcome home, Robb. Let us see to your horses and share some proper food. We have much to talk about." A hush of anticipation spread as Robb nodded, falling into step beside Edmure, with Jon close behind. Grey Wind padded among the men, exuding a primal presence that no one dared challenge. In the great hall, they soon gathered around a long table. Servants hurried in with bread, salt, and flagons of watered wine. Robb remained standing until the formalities were observed. Edmure introduced him to Davos Seaworth and the Baratheon knights who had accompanied him. Davos spoke politely of King Stannis' respect for Robb's battles in the field, acknowledging that the young wolf had won renown across the realm. Robb's expression held a mixture of pride and fatigue. "Renown doesn't feed my men or bring my father back, nor does it end this war. Still, I appreciate King Stannis' words." He looked to Edmure, then Jon. "So, tell me all. Start from the moment Joffrey lost his head." Jon obliged, describing the black night of the battle and the swirl of wildfire on the Blackwater. How Stannis' forces had forced entry to the Red Keep, and how he'd found Joffrey cornered with only 2 Kingsguard. Jon recounted the fight, sparing no detail. How quickly the Kingsguard fell, and how Joffrey's final attack was clumsy with fear. How the Boy King's blood stained the stones. Robb listened without interruption, though his knuckles whitened around the edge of the table. When Jon finished, Robb exhaled sharply. "That is justice of a sort," he said, voice tight. "If only father had been spared. But no man can undo the past." He closed his eyes briefly, a flicker of pain in his face. Then he turned to Davos. "So Stannis sits the Iron Throne now?" Davos nodded. "Aye, your grace. He has proclaimed himself the rightful king and named me hand. We hold the city. Word spreads that Joffrey is dead. Some of the Lannisters' lesser allies have begun to waver. Yet Tywin Lannister remains a threat, and we do not know what moves the Tyrells might make. And you want me to bend the knee to Stannis to accept him as my king? After my lords declared me king in the north." Davos spoke gently. "We understand your position. I will not lie, Stannis does expect the north to return to the fold. But he offers a generous arrangement. The north shall remain largely autonomous, with you as warden, and the Riverlands would be secure under Edmure Tully, free from Lannister dominion. Together, we might bring an end to this bloody war." Robb's eyes flicked to Jon. "And you stand by this? You trust Stannis to keep his word?" Jon hesitated, searching for honesty. "I believe he is a hard man, but not a liar. His sense of duty is rigid. If he gives his word, he will keep it. I've no illusions that the North would be wholly independent. It wouldn't, but it would have some measure of respect and self-determination, more than under the Lannisters." The men around the table exchanged glances. Some of Robb's bannermen looked uneasy, others thoughtful. Edmure's expression was guarded, unsure. At length, Robb spread his hands. "These are terms I must weigh carefully. My men have fought and died believing in northern independence. But they also fought for justice for my father, and to see the Lannisters brought low. With Joffrey dead, we have part of that justice. The main threat now is Tywin Lannister." He paused. "If we can unite to destroy Tywin's army, then perhaps the realm can know peace at last. But can I truly kneel to any southern king after all that's happened?" Davos leaned forward. "King Stannis understands pride and principle. But he also knows the realm cannot endure two kings, not when the Lannisters still pose a mortal danger to everyone. I beg you to consider the greater good." Robb's gaze hardened just a fraction. The greater good was seldom offered to the North by the Iron Throne in ages past. My father served King Robert loyally and was repaid with betrayal and death. His voice turned quiet. "Yet, if you are sincere, perhaps we can find a path. I will need time to speak with my bannermen to consider how best to proceed. I did not ride here simply to yield, nor do I want the war to drag on forever." Davos nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I understand completely, Your Grace. Take the time you need. We will remain here under Edmure's hospitality, if he'll allow it." Edmure inclined his head. "Of course, and we'll keep these negotiations discreet. The last thing we need is a surprise attack from the Freys or some Lannister raiding party." The hall settled into a contemplative silence. Servants drifted in with trays of roast fish and barley bread, setting them on the table. Robb's men began to shed their traveling dust, removing cloaks and gloves, while gray wind prowled near Robb's chair, occasionally dipping his nose toward the food. Jon remained standing for a moment, watching his brother's face. He could see how the burden of kingship weighed on Robb, how each passing day aged him beyond his years. When the meal began, conversation turned to lighter topics. Tales of battles fought, roads taken, men lost. Robb asked Jon about the Night's Watch, about whether the threat beyond the wall was truly as dire as old stories claimed. Jon tried to explain the existence of White Walkers, but the words felt inadequate. It was easy to dismiss such tales when men had more immediate enemies in their midst. As the evening wore on, Robb and Jon found a moment to walk along Riverrun's walls, just the two of them. The sky was clear, stars hanging above like scattered diamonds. They looked out over the dark waters of the rivers below, the hush of the night broken only by the distant chirp of crickets. Gray wind padded behind them, quiet as a shadow. Robb spoke first, voice hushed. "When I first heard the rumor that you'd killed Joffrey, I didn't believe it. It sounded like a campfire boast. Then Edmure's raven came, and here you are." Jon stared into the water's slow swirl. "I didn't set out to kill a king, or break my vows, or any of this. It happened so fast, Robb. One moment the battle was raging. The next I stood before Joffrey. All I could think of was father's head on the steps of the Great September, Sansa's tears, everything that boy had done. Robb pressed his lips into a thin line. Father wouldn't have wanted you to break your vows, but perhaps he'd have understood. The realm is a twisted place. Still, I don't know where that leaves you now. Jon glanced at him. Me neither. I pledged loyalty to Stannis, hoping it would help protect the realm, bring some stability. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe it was the only choice. I don't know. But if there's a chance to end this war and keep the North from more suffering, I have to try. Robb nodded. I've lost too many men already. The Lannisters hound me at every turn, and the Freys are no allies. Roose Bolton's been unpredictable. I feel the North slipping through my fingers. Every day I'm forced to make compromises. I lost the Karstarks' full support when I executed Lord Rickard Karstark after he murdered Lannister hostages. My own mother freed Jaime Lannister in a desperate bid to save Sansa and Arya. It's all crumbling, Jon. He exhaled shakily, and for a moment Jon saw the boy who used to laugh with him in the courtyard of Winterfell. Jon set a hand on Robb's shoulder. We have to keep going. We're Starks, remember? Robb gave a bitter smile. A Stark and a Snow, but there was warmth in his eyes, as though remembering the closeness they once shared. All right, I'll talk to my lords, see how they feel about Stannis' proposal. I'll weigh it against all the other storms in my path. Maybe we can find a peace. Maybe the White Walkers beyond the wall truly are stirring. If so, we'll need every man in the realm to stand together. Jon nodded. That's all I ask. They lapsed into silence, each lost in his own thoughts. After a time, Robb began to speak of simpler memories. Walking by the hot springs at Winterfell, seeing Arya run with a wooden sword in hand, hearing Sansa's songs. The recollections felt like echoes of a life that belonged to strangers, but it warmed Jon's heart all the same. For a moment, they found solace in the bond of family, even if only in reminiscence. When they parted, Robb retired to the quarters Edmure had prepared, and Jon returned to his own small chamber in one of Riverrun's turrets. He lay awake, listening to the distant rush of water, wondering if the gods were indeed guiding them to a place of reconciliation, or if they were simply pawns on a board too vast to comprehend. The following days were a whirlwind of councils, discussions, and debates. Robb met privately with his bannermen, men like the Blackfish Brynden Tully, Edmure's uncle, who had returned to Riverrun to aid in its defense. The Blackfish eyed Jon warily, but acknowledged that House Stark's need for allies was desperate. Lords such as Galbart Glover and Meege Mormont sent word that they would follow Robb's lead, though they bristled at the idea of once again bending the knee to a southern king. Others, like Roose Bolton, offered no response, heightening Robb's anxiety. Jon tried not to interfere too much, knowing that, as a man sworn to Stannis, his presence already colored the negotiations. He spent his hours training in the yard, or sitting with Davos, who took notes in a small ledger, carefully cataloging every question or concern raised by Robb's lords. Gradually, a sense of possibility began to surface. If they hammered out the right guarantees for northern autonomy, if Robb felt certain Sansa and Arya, if Arya could be found, would be protected, if Edmure could be assured that the Riverlands would be free from Lannister retribution, perhaps an alliance truly could form. One evening, a raven arrived bearing an ominous note. Tywin Lannister had mustered his forces near Harrenhal, forging alliances with remnants of other houses that feared Stannis' new rule. There were rumors the Tyrells might yet be in secret talks with him, possibly to marry Margaery Tyrell to another Lannister scion, Tommen or whomever might serve as a figurehead king. War was far from done. The question was which side would strike first. Robb read this letter in grim silence, his lips compressed into a line of worry. He lifted his eyes to Jon and Davos. So Tywin rallies. If we remain divided, he might crush Stannis in King's Landing, then turn on us, or he might come for me first. Our only chance is to stand together. Davos nodded. That is precisely King Stannis' position, Your Grace. Robb's expression was flinty. Then I will stand with Stannis against Tywin, if Stannis confirms the North's rights and returns my sisters unharmed. I'll kneel, if that's the cost of ensuring the Lannisters are finished. He rapped his knuckles against the table. But I want a formal document signed, sealed. Stannis will declare me Warden of the North, with the power to name my own successors, and he'll set Sansa free immediately. Arya too, if she can be found. And no man shall question the North's ancient privileges." Davos exhaled a breath of relief. "I believe these terms are acceptable, Your Grace. I can draft the agreement. Once you affix your seal, I'll have it sent by raven or courier to King's Landing for Stannis' signature. Then we can plan the campaign to face Tywin." Robb paused. "I'll also want the Riverlands recognized as Edmure Tully's rightful domain, free of any Lannister claim. Ensure that is in the document." "Of course," Davos said. "We shall list all relevant terms, including provisions for the Tullys and any other houses who join." Robb gave a curt nod, as though sealing his inner resolve. So be it. That night, the great hall buzzed with hushed anticipation as the scribes and stewards prepared the official parchment. Edmure moved among the men, trying to project confidence. Beyond the castle walls, the rivers glimmered under a crescent moon, and it seemed the entire fortress held its breath, waiting to see if these negotiations would herald the end of one war and the beginning of another. Jon walked alone along a parapet, staring out across the water. Gray wind prowled below, his silhouette visible near the stables. For the first time, Jon felt a strange flicker of hope. If Robb and Stannis joined forces, they might defeat Tywin, and all the lingering Lannister loyalists might carve a path to relative peace. Then, perhaps, the realm could focus on the true threat in the far north. He closed his eyes, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against stone. He thought of Ned Stark's quiet strength, of how he might have counseled unity to end the bloodshed. The father who raised Jon had believed in duty above all. Perhaps, in some small way, this was a chance for Jon to honor his memory, by helping forge the alliances needed to save the realm from further ruin. Yet somewhere, in the back of Jon's mind, lingered the old presence of dread. War was never so easily tamed, especially not in Westeros. Tywin Lannister was a cunning foe, and the Tyrells were unpredictable. Roose Bolton and Walder Frey each had their own ambitions, and beyond the shining horizon of these southern wars lay the silent, frozen plains of the north, where an ancient enemy stirred, heedless of the crowns and titles of men. But for now, at least, there was one small corner of hope. Joffrey Baratheon's cruel reign was ended by Jon's hand, a deed that might, against all odds, unite the Stark wolf and the Baratheon stag to bring down the Lion of Lannister. The realm stood on the brink of a new age. Whether it would be an age of respite or a final storm, Jon could not say. All he knew was that, at last, there was a chance to push forward, to do something beyond simple vengeance. He lifted his gaze to the moonlit sky. Somewhere, far away, Ghost might be running free under those same stars, or searching for his master across the wild hills. Jon's heart clenched at the thought of his old companion, the pure white direwolf that had been his solace at the wall. He whispered a silent promise that, if fate allowed, he would see his wolf again, and with luck, in a world less haunted by the cruelty of kings. In Riverrun's halls, scribes bent over parchment, quills scratching. Lords whispered of armies, banners, and alliances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles of words or steel. But for this moment, Jon Snow allowed himself the smallest ember of hope, that the blood spilled on the Blackwater had not been entirely in vain, and that the memory of Ned Stark would guide them to a better tomorrow. And so the night deepened, cloaking castle and rivers in hush, while the realm's destiny turned upon the pivot of a single death, the death of a cruel boy king, at the hand of a bastard who had once pledged himself to a different life. The wheel of fate spun on, and in its turning, Jon Snow and Robb Stark and all of House Stark sought to carve a path toward peace, uncertain yet determined, hoping that somewhere in the swirling darkness of war lay the dawn that Westeros so desperately needed.